Question everybody. We all love to gawk at a tank, don't we? But what's even better than gawking at just any old tank? That's right, gawking at a really, really big one. And boy, have we got you covered on that front. Because today we're going to be taking a look at the heaviest tank ever built by the US. And here it is. Behold. Called the T-28, but also known colloquially as the Doom Turtle, this absolute unit of a tank, despite being 80-ish years old now, is over 20 tons heavier than the latest and greatest M1 Abrams and over triple the weight of the most spruced up M3 Bradley, coming in at a mighty 95 tons. Interested? Well, of course you are. So let's not faff about and let's get into it. Alright, before we dive into the T-28 specifically, it's worth us taking the time to have a look at super heavy tanks more generally. They are such an oddity in the grand scheme of things, and so underappreciated in wider history, that to not explore such things would risk you leaving the video with your knowledge of the T-28 existing within a vacuum, totally devoid of the full context you need to really appreciate it. As for what a super heavy tank actually is, that bit is at least easy. Kind of anyway, because just like it says on the tin, they are the really, really big ones. Where it gets more difficult, however, is in the minutiae, because on account of them being such an outlier historically, there is also no fully agreed upon technical definition of when a heavy tank becomes super heavy. The number of tons it must weigh, the caliber of the gun it must carry, things like that, they're not used. Instead, it's vaguely defined as any tank that is notably bigger than its contemporary heavy tanks, with the actual judgment being rendered by the collective consensus of both tank historians and lay military history enthusiasts alike. As for the idea of a super heavy tank, that dates back to World War I, when, with tanks having made quite the good impression upon the military types of the day, they naturally wanted to take the idea to its extreme and make something really big. As back in those days, when tank doctrine was very much a crude thing, a bigger tank could only be better. Right? Their pursuit wasn't a niche one either, as basically everyone explored the idea of a super heavy tank with varying degrees of both zeal and success. The British, for example, worked on the 100-ton Flying Elephant that never left the drawing board. The Germans, for their part, came up with the 120-ton K-Wagon, two prototypes of which were kinda completed come the war's end, and the French worked on the comparatively modest 70-ton Char 2C. Unlike the Germans and the Brits, however, the 2C would actually be fully completed, with it entering service in 1921 and 10 of them being built, still to this day remaining the biggest tank ever built, at least by physical dimensions. Alright, just before we continue with today's video, I want to ask you something, and let's be honest, how often do you find yourself mindlessly scrolling on your phone, soaking up absolutely nothing? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty guilty of that. But what if instead of scrolling, you could actually learn something useful perhaps? And that's where Imprint comes in. Imprint is a beautifully designed app that turns all that wasted screen time into quick, interactive lessons. I'm talking about topics that actually matter: psychology, leadership, happiness science. No more doom scrolling, just learning. Plus, it's all illustrated and animated, which makes it easy to stay focused. For example, I've been diving into their interpersonal dynamics course, learning about the psychology of human relationships. It's insightful, it's interactive, and best of all, it takes just a few minutes every day. Plus, the app is designed with science behind it: habit building, visual learning, testing what you've learned, and letting you progress at your own pace. It's learning made easy, effective, and actually fun. Honestly, if you're going to be glued to your phone, why not learn something while you're at it? So here's the deal. Imprint is offering a free 7-day trial plus 20% off an annual subscription if you head to imprintapp.com/megaproject or click the link in the description below and start learning something new today. Big thanks to Imprint for sponsoring, and now back to it. Now, we've talked a lot on this channel about the flinging shit and seeing what sticks approach to tank design during the interwar periods, in which tanks were such a new thing that no one really had any idea what was a good idea or what was a bad one, at least until World War II came a-knocking and provided a pretty real opportunity to try them out and see what worked and what didn't. And throughout that period, to many tank designers, super heavy tank designs lingered above them as the ultimate machine for mechanized warfare, which saw a myriad of designs get proposed, with examples including the 110-ton Soviet T-42 and the 130-ton French Char de Fortresse ARL. Due to budget constraints, however, what with the Great Depression and all that, neither of those incredible machines would ever be built and put into service, and neither would any other, with the Char 2C remaining the only example put into service come the outbreak of World War II. The outbreak of war, however, finally brought both the need to start taking super heavy tank designs more seriously and the funding to see them completed. And so, new, actually completed designs started appearing. Examples from Britain include the 90-ton TOG-2 from 1941 and the similarly heavy A-39 Tortoise from 1945. The Germans were similarly enthusiastic, with them producing the 200-ton Panzer VIII Maus in 1944, and unlike the World War I super heavies, both the successful and unsuccessful ones, now some actual refined thought was being given to their use on the battlefield beyond just, well, bigger is better. The TOG-2, for example, was designed to be the ultimate trench warfare tank, something that could prevent the trench warfare deadlock of World War I, being a lump of steel sufficiently strong and powerful enough to simply push through enemy trenches as if they weren't even there, while the Tortoise was designed specifically to deal with defensive lines by having enough armor and a gun powerful enough to allow it to be plonked out in a field, soak up some fire, and systematically destroy bunkers one at a time. The Panzer VIII Maus was similarly focused, just with the capability to also take on tanks, hence its turret. All of those, however, were ultimately failures of one kind or another, with not a single one of them even being mass-produced, never mind actually seeing combat. But they prove the point nonetheless that come the time of the T-28, super heavy tanks had become ultra-specialist vehicles designed for specific tasks on the battlefield, and to do them, and nothing but them, really well, at the expense of other design characteristics, namely speed and mobility. And that brings us nicely to the American efforts with the big stuff, or rather, the lack thereof. You see, although they had produced a heavy tank during World War II, specifically the Liberty, which came in at a little over 41 tons, they never seriously floated the idea of a super heavy during the conflict, and neither did they in the interwar period. This is much of a surprise, as compared to European powers, America really neglected its tank forces during the interwar period, which led to them being at a major disadvantage when war loomed on the horizon once again, as it left them with a small number of tanks of very questionable quality. Think the M2 light tank and the M2 medium tank, and you get the idea. They quickly got their act together, however, at which point those clunkers were replaced with the ones we know and love from our favorite war movies, your M4 Shermans, M18 Hellcats, M24 Chafees, and things like that. And this meant that, like their European counterparts, the US found itself with a sophisticated domestic tank industry capable of taking on big projects both figuratively and literally. Thus, the T-28's die found itself cast in 1944, when American troops, having landed and secured themselves quite comfortable foothold in continental Europe, were starting to have to entertain the prospect of dealing with the Siegfried Line, Germany's extensive defensive line on its western border. It was no Maginot Line, don't get us wrong, but it was still quite the formidable thing nonetheless, and so the T-28 was born as a solution to deal with it, an indomitable hunk of steel that could absorb everything the Siegfried Line could throw at it, while gaily taking its time in returning the favor until a nice big hole had been made for the rest of the army to pour through. As for its development history, we will spare you a deep dive, as frankly, it's pretty boring. Lots of ex-engineer talking to Y-engineer and thinking he's a tool for saying 19.5 inches of traverse is adequate when he thought they should push for 20 inches, and so on and so forth. It's boring. But just so you aren't completely in the dark, here's the Cliff Notes version. Having only started design work in 1943, there simply wasn't enough time to see it completed for its intended purpose, with the Siegfried Line campaign, which saw Allied troops push against the titular line, beginning in September 1944 and concluding with a victory in December of that same year, by which time they were happily through it, and at the same time, the Allies also started a campaign in Belgium with a view to circumventing it altogether, although that would drag on and Belgium wouldn't be liberated until January 1945. Despite that, however, mostly because the brass envisioned it potentially being useful in an invasion of the Japanese mainland, the Pacific Car and Foundry, which was working on the T-28, kept at it and produced 2 examples come the war's end, at which point, with it then being deemed unnecessary, the original contract for 5 examples was cancelled. And with that said, we can now move on to the real meat of today's video: the T-28's crazy design. All right, now we might have told you a little bit of a lie in the introduction, kind of, anyway. You see, a debate exists on whether or not the T-28 is actually a tank at all, as some argued that it is in fact an assault gun, i.e. a type of self-propelled artillery that uses an infantry support gun mounted on a usually armored motorized chassis and is designed to provide direct fire support for infantry attacks, especially against other infantry or fortified positions. This debate is not a new one either, as reflected by the many different names the T-28 has had bestowed upon it during its time. For example, it started out life as the Assault Tank Project in summer 1943. It was then renamed to Heavy Tank T-28 by December of that year, reflecting its intended role as a heavily armored assault vehicle. But then in 1945, it was changed again to 105mm gun motor carriage T-95 since it lacked a turret and had limited gun traverse, like other gun motor carriages. The designation didn't last long, however, as it reverted back to T-28 in 1946 when it was decided that its thicker armor and role still fit the description of a tank rather than a gun motor carriage. So yeah, in short, I mean, knows what it actually is. We'll leave it to you to make your own mind up on the matter, but we'll stick to calling it the T-28 tank, as that is both nice and easy to say, and what it is most known as anyway. As for its design, we already know that it weighed in at a colossal 95 tons, which represents it with a full combat load, i.e. a full complement of 62 rounds for its big gun, all of its crew, and all the other stuff that it needed to go into combat. Otherwise, it weighed, and we're being specific now that we aren't in the contextual chapter, 90.3 tons empty and 65.5 tons empty without its extra tracks. A design choice we'll discuss more in just a little bit. With numbers like these, it remains easily one of the heaviest combat vehicles ever designed right to this very day. Naturally, much of this weight came from the vast amount of armor, which was intended to offer unparalleled protection against all threats on the battlefield. And if you want specifics, it had exactly 12 inches on its front glacis, 10 inches on the upper frontal hull, 5 inches on the lower frontal hull, and 5.5 inches over the tracks. This, there's no other way to say it, was an insane amount of armor for the time. For comparison, the venerable M4 Sherman had give or take 2.5 inches on the front variants depending, and the even beefier still M26 Pershing, one of the heavier tanks the US fielded during World War II, only had a maximum armor thickness of 5 inches on the turret. And if you want another fact to put the crazy amount of armor the T-28 had into perspective, consider this. The 88mm PAK-43, the creme de la creme of German anti-tank guns, could get through around 8 inches of armor at point-blank range. So yes, the T-28 was perfectly well protected. Further still, the T-28 also incorporated some sloped armor into its design, as many tanks of its day did. This is an interesting choice to be sure, as back then, and still to this day, sloped armor is a big deal. And since we've talked a lot about sloped armor over the years, we won't stress too much about the full ins and outs of why that's a good thing. But for those of you who missed those videos, here's the short version. Firstly, it increases the effective thickness of the armor because when a projectile impacts a sloped plate, there is a greater length of metal that it has to get through. And secondly, sloped armor also increases the likelihood of rounds deflecting rather than penetrating due to complicated math reasons that we don't really need to worry about. Following along? Excellent. Now, moving on from its armor, let's talk about the centerpiece of any tank, the big bang bang bit. In the T-28, this came in the form of the 105mm T5E1 gun. By World War II standards, a bore of that size was simply enormous, with, for comparison, the famously upgunned Sherman Firefly only having a 76.2mm gun, and the fearsome Tiger II only having an 88mm one. This meant that it could chuck some big rounds downrange, and thanks to the 22 feet and 5 inches length of its barrel, it sent them down at some serious speeds too, which only served to make it even more deadly. As for specific rounds it fired, that'd be things like the T-13E1 armor-plating capped ballistic rounds, which could penetrate up to 8.5 inches of vertical steel plate at point-blank range. It also fired the T-32, a round of the same type, which could penetrate even more, specifically up to 9.25 inches at similar ranges. Both of those are rather lackluster, however, compared to the main rounds that it could send downrange, and that'd be the T-29E3 high-velocity armor-piercing round, which could penetrate a whole 15 inches of armor. For context on why these numbers are so good, the Tiger II, large and ferocious though its reputation is, only had 7.28 inches of armor at its thickest point. And while we've already said that the T-28 wasn't exactly brisk on its tracks, let's go into specifics of just how slow it was. 8 miles an hour. That was it. Worse still, that 8 miles an hour was on flat and unbroken road. If it was off-road, in the kind of conditions that say existed on the approach to any fortification, halve it if you were lucky. Naturally, some of this was down to the crazy amount of armor, as we mentioned earlier, but a lot of it was down to the fact that it actually had a pretty shite engine in terms of power anyway. Put it this way, a Cromwell had a V12 Rolls-Royce Meteor engine crammed into its hull that put out give or take 600 horsepower, and a Panther had a Maybach H3 230 engine of as many cylinders that produced around 700 horsepower. And by comparison, the T28 had a mere V8, specifically a Ford Gaff that put out 500 horsepower, and that's generous. Petrolhead wisdom may hold that you're never late in a V8, but anyone who would say that has clearly never gone in a T28. Historians haven't really given an answer on why the T28 had such a modestly powered engine, so we're unable to speak with any certainty, but if you want our 2 cents on the matter, notably the Americans didn't really do big tank engines during the war with the 9-cylinder Wright R975 Whirlwind that powered some Shermans and the M18 Hellcat, putting out in the region of 400 horsepower, so we suspect they simply used what was available rather than stressing about sourcing a really powerful engine for a tank that, in fairness, wasn't exactly expected to move quickly anyway. It also has to be said that by the time the Ford Gaff was stuffed into the Pershing, they had managed to get around 500 horsepower out of it, so, I mean, who knows? Maybe the T28 would have found itself with more power had fate been kinder to it, but we digress. And while we're on the topic of things that the T28 didn't do very well, let's discuss its range, because thanks to all of that weight, on a good day, if you read a really gentle foot, you could just about get 100 miles out of a single tank. This, again, was a calculated sacrifice, because if it was ever to be deployed to battle, it would be moved by either train or truck vaguely close to whatever needed to be blown up, and then would trundle over a hill and get the job done and trundle back. Didn't need to be a marathon runner, and so range was sacrificed for armor. Easy. And if you're wondering about economy, because who doesn't love an absolutely horrible statistic, we have done the maths and figured out that since it had a 100-mile range and a fuel tank of 400 gallons, that means it'd get a whopping 0.25 miles to the gallon. And for those of you in the audience who aren't drivers and need a point of reference of how horrific that is, the Dacia Sandero, Europe's current best-selling car, can squeeze into the mid-50s if it's driven sympathetically. And that's pretty much the normal technical overview done and dusted. So before we finish this chapter, let's take a look at a few of the T28's more interesting quirks and features, starting with the barrel. See how it's perfectly smooth without the weird little bump that you get on modern tank barrels? Well, that weird little bump is something called a bore evacuator, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It pulls the smoke created by a discharged round out of the tank so that it doesn't go back into the cabin. Mind you, basically no World War II tanks had one either, with them only really starting to become a thing late in the war, but for most tanks of the period, this was an inconvenience that you could work around. For the T28, however, the sheer size of its enormous powder charges, supposedly even discharging one round, immediately filled the cabin with smoke that majorly obstructed vision, and if the gunner was on a mad one, well, the rest of the crew better had a hatch open if they happened to be partial to breathing. And that was even if you could fire it, because apparently, due to the heavily cramped interior, loading the rounds, which came in 2 parts due to their sheer size, was at best a Herculean feat of strength, and at worst, downright impossible when the gun was traversed at certain angles. Then there were its tracks. Much like the Tiger I famously did, the T28 also had a track arrangement that made it easier to transport. But unlike the Tiger I, which had a whole other thinner set for such purposes, in the T28, this was done by simply removing 2 of its 4 tracks. Doing so, however, took hours and was an absolute nightmare of a task. As with the fate of the 2 T28s produced, that's just a bit different to the usual X amount was scrapped and Y amount was sent to museums type of explanation, because while one of them was completely destroyed by an engine fire early after World War II and subsequently scrapped, so far so normal, the other one hung around for a while, where it was used essentially as a portable weight for stress testing trailers and things like that, and then in February 1964, it vanished. And we mean it totally vanished, just overnight, as explained by the following testimony from one Captain Schrader, who was posted to the Aberdeen Proving Ground, quoting him. In February 1964, I was a private on a work detail painting the T28 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. One night, as we were coming back from the 123 Club, we saw the T28 moving out of the base's industrial area. Its passing was something like a freight locomotive as the ground moved under our feet, not a lot, but enough to let you know that about 100 tons was passing by. I never saw the T28 again. Then, for a decade, no one seemed to know where it had ended up that night. Had it been scrapped? Had it been stolen? Had it been thrown into some warehouse and forgotten about? No one knew, and heads were being scratched all over, wondering just what had happened to this peculiar relic. And then, out of the blue, in 1974, an Army Reserve captain by the name of Gil Berman, who was posted to Fort Belvoir, sent a letter to the office of the Chief of Military History informing him that a T-28 was currently sitting dumped on the facility's secret night vision testing facility, and that he might want to consider trying to get his hands on the historically important vehicle. Many dismissed the letter as a joke, but one curator took it seriously and headed down to verify it for himself, and sure enough, stuffed behind some bushes that had long since grown beyond head height, there it was. Despite having spent over a decade exposed to the elements, with no one having any idea how it got there, the T-28 was deemed restorable, and so it formally entered the Patton Museum's collection in April 1975. They then fixed it back up, and after being passed around museums, it today sits on display at the US Army Armor and Cavalry Collection in Fort Moore, Georgia.